If at his counsel I should turn aside into that ominous tract which, all agree, hides the dark tower. Not it, I fancied Cuthbert's reddening face, beneath its garniture of curly gold. Childe Roland to the dark tower came. His word was still fi, foe, and foam. I smell the blood of a British man. Over the safe road, it was gone, great plain all around. Sirs, I command you to fill the places of Oliver and Roland. One of you shall carry the sword, the other the horn. So Childe Roland said the two things over and over again, till he knew them by heart, and he thanked the warlock Merlin and went on his way. If you've read Stephen King's Dark Tower series, these lines might sound familiar. References to the tower itself, Roland, the wastelands that he traveled, and his friend and fellow Quartet member Cuthbert all could have been taken right from the Gunslinger or the Wastelands. Might be surprised to learn that these are all taken from other sources, and none of them are from Stephen King. King has always been known to wear his influences on his sleeve, and he's never afraid to throw references to everything from pop culture, literature, or his own life and personal experiences. And it's one of the things that make his stories so interesting. Roland and the Dark Tower have a history that spans long before Stephen King's magnum opus, appearing in literature from medieval France to 19th century England to the modern day United States. Let's take a look at some of those different works that might have influenced Roland and the Dark Tower, and the similarities and differences between them. It's no secret that the mid-19th century poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning is a core influence on the Dark Tower series. It features our favorite protagonist Roland, who forges ahead through a barren wasteland towards the Dark Tower, his final destination. This isn't a story of a brave hero on a daring quest, but a beaten down man full of regret and fading hope, with only one thing left to live for. I'd like to walk through a quick version of the story with you since the poem itself isn't long, and the story as a whole has such a strong connection to the King novels. Note that the term child will be used quite a bit throughout this video. It can be spelled with or without the last E and references the fact that the person is a noble son that hasn't yet attained knighthood. If at his counsel should I turn aside to that ominous tract which, all agree, hides the Dark Tower, yet acquiescingly. I did turn as he pointed, neither pride nor hope rekindling at the end descried, so much as gladness that some end might be. In the opening stanzas, we see titular character Roland finishing a conversation with a haggard old man. This man gives Roland his first hint on where to find the tower. He suggests Roland divert from the main road and take an ominous path that actually leads to the tower. Roland doesn't believe this path leads to the tower, and sees the man as untrustworthy and malicious, but after years of searching, he truly has no other options. We find out that he isn't the only one searching for the tower, and no other members of the band have had the luck of finding it either, to the point where people dismiss any of the knights who still search for it. Deciding to leave the man and take his advice, Roland steps out onto the ominous path and is surprised to find the world has changed around him. The road behind him disappears, and all he sees is a vast plain in front and behind him, not unlike the wasteland that Roland Deschain travels. Since the only thing around him is wasteland, Roland heads forward. He can't believe how barren the land is around him, noting that even a burr would be a treasure. He comes across a horse so starved that he couldn't tell if it was alive or dead. Its body was so grotesque that Roland found himself hating the creature, thinking to himself that it must have been wicked to deserve such pain. The depressing surroundings are so overwhelming, he tries to think of his old friends, Cuthbert and Giles, to bring him comfort. He remembers them fondly at first, before remembering how they had let him down and disappeared from his life. These memories bring him back to the present, and Roland suggests he'd rather be alone in the wasteland than be let down like that again. He returns to thinking about his journey, wishing there was anything in the landscape to distract him from his thoughts. Eventually, he comes suddenly across a river that he must forge. As he crosses it, he feels himself stepping on the faces of people submerged under the river, noting the feelings of dead men's cheeks, hair, and beards. He hears a baby's shriek and hopes it's simply a water rat. As he gets to the other bank and sees more wasteland, he wonders what apocalyptic event might have happened here that would make the world so desolate. He continues on and begins to see changes to the environment. Moss here and there, a tree, and a bog. Finally, he finds himself at the foot of a mountain that he can't pass. He almost gives up before he realizes that a couple small hills to his right are hiding the tower itself. Overjoyed and seeing visions of his loved ones surrounding him, he blows his horn and shouts, "Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came." But just a note that Browning calls it the slug horn, which we'll revisit later. We never learn what is actually in the tower, but we also know that that isn't really the point. Similar to MacGuffins in other stories, although maybe a little bit more specifically of MacGuffin here, the tower is just the reason for the journey. Final goal doesn't really matter. I also want to point out an explicit reference to the poem in the Wastelands, specifically Jake Chambers' school essay called My Understanding of Truth. Jake's mind is breaking at this point in the story after dying in his world, then again in Roland's, and visions of Roland are intruding on his thoughts constantly. This essay is when he really goes over the edge and you can see how fixated he is on the wasteland in Roland. As a side note, I'd also want to point out the little Easter egg references that are layered on these quotes and how they emphasize Jake's obsession with getting back to Roland's world. The first quote by T.S. Eliot is from his renowned modernist poem, The Wasteland. You can see the resemblance to the imagery of the wastelands in both the Dark Tower series and Browning's poem. The second quote by Browning is directly from the first line of his poem, while Roland is talking to the old man who sends him down the ominous path towards the tower. In addition to these two passages, you'll notice the nicknames that Jake gave to each author, references to the legendary Western film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, about two outlaws running from the law. But I digress. Let's take a look at a probable inspiration for Browning's poem, the Song of Roland, and how it may have inspired parts of the Dark Tower series as well. The Song of Roland is an epic poem that tells the story of the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. Written sometime between the 11th and 12th centuries in medieval France, it tells a dramatized story of the death of Charlemagne's nephew and general. Though it isn't as explicitly mentioned as an inspiration for King's Dark Tower, there's certainly inspiration taken by Browning in his poem, and plenty of parallels we can find between it and King's novels. Much like Browning's Roland and King's Roland, the Song of Roland is a story of betrayal, courage, and what we leave behind. I also want to mention that I'll be specifically talking about the poem and not the actual historical event. The story begins with Charlemagne's Franks warring against the Saracens in Spain, with the former winning handily. The Saracens send a messenger to Charlemagne, telling him that they're willing to sign a treaty to end the war. Though the Franks are winning, the war has been long and they are eager to end it as well, and agree. Roland tells Charlemagne that his stepfather, Ganelon, should be the one to go and deliver the message. Ganelon, however, is convinced that Roland only wants him to go because of the risk of the Saracens killing the messenger, so he conceives a plot to get revenge. Ganelon does make his way to the Saracens, but instead of relaying the treaty agreement, he tells them that the rear of Charlemagne's army is vulnerable and that the tide of battle could turn if they attack in the right place. Of course, this vulnerability is guarded by Roland himself along with his troops, meaning Ganelon is setting Roland up to be killed. Connecting this back to King's Dark Tower, this theme of a trusted member of the kingdom committing treason and backstabbing Roland reminds me a lot of Martin Broadcloak, later known as the Man in Black, who was the court magician and trusted advisor for Roland's father, Stephen Deshane. This trust was of course misplaced, as Martin sold them out to their enemy, the Crimson King. He let slow mutants into Gilead, killed Roland's best friend Cuthbert, and many other gunslingers, and ultimately caused the destruction of everything that Roland knew and loved. Going back to the story, after the Saracens learned of the Franks' weakness, they did decide to attack, surprising Roland and his advisors and overwhelming them immediately. As the fighting begins, I want to mention that Roland carried into battle two important objects, his sword Durandal and his horn. These two objects both have importance in the story and in its connection to the Dark Tower series. Durandal is a true-to-life weapon that the real Roland actually had, and according to legend, he had thrown it into the side of a cliff, where a replication can still be viewed today. In the Song of Roland, the sword had biblical powers as it was infused with a tooth of St. Peter, the blood of St. Basil, hair of St. Denis, and a piece of the Virgin Mary's clothing. You can see a parallel here between Durandal and the sandalwood guns of Roland Deshane. The horn is also something that both Rolands share, though Deshane's horn had a stronger symbolic meaning to him, which was of course the horn of Eld that had been passed down from the original gunslinger Arthur Eld. Roland's horn was meant as a last option, a desperate call for help when he would have no other option. In fact, in the Song of Roland, his advisor Oliver begs him to use the horn as soon as the battle begins, but Roland rejects the idea outright as cowardly. Not until the battle is almost over and he sees that there is no way out, does Roland finally blow the horn with all his might, so hard that his temples actually begin to bleed. Shortly after blowing the horn, he succumbs to his injuries and dies. Those familiar with the Dark Tower series might recognize that this isn't so different from the way Cuthbert dies in the Battle of Jericho Hill, blowing the horn of Eld shortly before his death. Also, don't forget that in Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, the poem ends with another reference to the horn. Dauntless the slug horn to my lips I set, and blew Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. As another aside, I originally took the term slughorn at face value, as just an old name for the horn that he was carrying. After looking up the term, it seems to be an incorrect use of the word from an 18th century poet that Browning used himself, and I just left it at that. However, while researching this story, I found a pretty great Reddit post talking about this. The original poster found a lot of the same things that I did, but also made some connections to the horn that I had breezed by, and I'd like to share it with you. I'll paste the link in the sources of this video, and anytime I mention something I found in their thread, I'll note their username in the corner of the screen, but the following is a direct quote from their thread. Browning's poem makes references to a slughorn, which according to Wikipedia isn't an actual historical horn or object at all, but rather an ancient or archaic version of the word slogan, which is the phonetic version of the older Scottish Gaelic word sligarum, which is literally translated to war cry. The word slogan itself could in a way mean sigil, and as the horn of Eld is Roland's true sigil, I can see the connection between the definition, the object, and the ancient translation. Continuing where we left off, Roland's horn does bring Charlemagne's army to them, but not until him and his army are massacred. Charlemagne drives the Saracens away and kills the portion of the army that had killed Roland and wiped out their rear guard. He then finds out about Ganelon's treason and imprisons him, though Ganelon argues in his trial that his betrayal was a personal one for what Roland had done and was not treasonous. Again, much like the Man in Black, Ganelon has a talent for talking his way out of anything, and manages to convince most of the other Franks of his innocence. However, his treachery is ended when one of Roland's defenders speaks out against him, triggering a trial by combat to decide Ganelon's fate and winning the trial despite poor odds. Ganelon is then subjected to one of the most brutal punishments you'll find in literature. He was drawn and quartered, and 30 of his relatives were hanged. That wraps up the recap of the Song of Roland. Let's continue on to our next historical Roland. One of the more obscure and least relevant Roland connections is one line in the Shakespearean tragedy King Lear. King's eldest son Edgar is pretending to be a madman named Tom O'Bedlam, who is talking gibberish to sell his insanity. He says the following at the end of Act 3, Scene 4. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. His word was still, fie, foe, and fum. I smell the blood of a British man. There doesn't seem to be any connection to our other Rolands outside of this reference to an old fairy tale, but it's interesting to see it pop up again nonetheless. Fairy tale itself, though, does have some references for us to explore. Childe Roland is a very old fairy tale that seems to have been passed down by word of mouth until it was published by Robert Jameson in 1814 and again by Joseph Jacobs in 1890. The story takes place in King Arthur's England, centered around his wizard Merlin and 4 of his children, notably the oldest Ellen, 2 middle boys, and Roland, the youngest. One of the more well-known Dark Tower connections to other literature is the comparisons between King Arthur and the original gunslinger Arthur Eld, as well as King Arthur's court wizard Merlin and the Dark Tower antagonist Merlin. The Dark Tower's Merlin is the Man in Black's father and possibly the reason for Arthur Eld fathering the Crimson King. Anyway, while playing with his siblings one day, Roland kicked a ball over a church. As his older sister Ellen went to retrieve it, she accidentally went around the church in a counterclockwise fashion. Well, of course, everyone knows that you must go around churches clockwise. This mistake caused her to vanish into thin air, and the brothers couldn't find her no matter where they looked. Desperately, Roland asked Merlin what could have happened to her. Merlin told him that he was taken by the king of Elfland, and it would take a strong knight to get her back. In the original story, she was taken to the Elfland Palace, but in Jacob's version, he changed the name to the Dark Tower. Note that Browning's poem came out between Jameson and Jacob's versions of the fairy tale, so Jacob's changing the name was most likely a nod to Browning's poem. And the presence of portals to other worlds is also another link between the fairy tale and the Dark Tower series. After both of his brothers attempt to retrieve his sister but never return, Roland is determined to go in himself. He is given his father's unbreakable, unmissable sword Excalibur, and is told that he must kill anyone who speaks to him and refuse food and drink until he finds his sister, and that these might be the reasons for his brothers not returning. Of course, in the Dark Tower novels, we find out that Roland's sandalwood guns are made directly from Excalibur, and the comparisons to Durandal in the Song of Roland are obvious. After speaking to and then killing multiple people, finally gets directions to the tower, only needing to circle a small hill 3 times and repeatedly telling the door to open. It's easy to see the similarities between this and the end of Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came, where Roland had almost given up before finding the hill that hid the tower. Roland finally enters the tower to find his sister alive but enchanted and completely under the spell of the Elfland King. She tells him he should not have come before offering him food. Roland almost accepts before remembering Merlin's warning about eating or drinking before bringing Ellen home. The king then jumps out and attacks him, saying the following that might remind you of the King Lear excerpt. Fie, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of a Christian man. Be he dead, be he living, with my brand, I'll dash his brains from his brain pan. They fight back and forth, but eventually Excalibur does its job and Roland wins, but he spares the king and in exchange for his life takes his siblings back home. After that, none of the family went counterclockwise around the church ever again. Thanks for watching this parade of Rolands. I was going to add a section here about Roland and King's other books, but after I started writing it, it seemed to be too off topic. If that's something you're interested in hearing about, please leave a comment and let me know. If you find any errors or have questions, please let me know, and I'm more than happy to add corrections when they're needed. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I like talking about stories that I enjoy, and I plan on making plenty of other Dark Tower and King Universe related content. I already have videos talking about Shine and the Gunslingers if you want to hear more about their universe right now.